Since we've talked in January, you've been bearish on gold. Your stance has proven true, although gold, as we know, rebounding in the last week, up 5% this week, but a big decline last week. How much further could gold fall?
Good question. A lot of people are definitely giving some indications out there as to where it could go. I mean, my feeling is that we could get a short-term rebound. I mean, there's a lot of physical activity out of India and China. Volumes have been pretty good. Let's talk about central banks as well buying. But I think the trend is still down, and so I still think we could test the 1200 level and possibly go below that one.
Why the sudden move in gold, Jeremy? Yes, you've been bearish since January, but why was last week's moves? Why did they happen?
Probably the market was starting to reconsider the outlook in terms of inflation, and for me they tended to price in more of a deflationary environment, and that really kicked off the movement in gold prices there.
Do you think that really happened at that period? Because, I mean, has it probably changed on the deflation front?
No, I wouldn't say there has changed much on that deflation front, but probably people were starting to realise that the inflation story is not really going to happen so soon. And so a couple of market makers, some larger volume holders there, definitely started to push gold prices lower, and once that happens, then it accentuated certain technical levels and then kicked off the selling even more. And then, of course, you're now starting to see more retail sales coming through, especially on the SPDR, the SPDR out of the US. So this has all accentuated the whole situation there. But there's definitely, I would say, a couple of big, large players in there that definitely started to push this thing lower. Must have been. It had to do, because that kind of movement has to come from some source.
Yes, I mean, and is the underlying story around gold or around commodities generally, is that under threat with regards to Chinese growth, perhaps wobbles in the US around March? What's the underlying growth story for commodities at the moment?
I think the underlying growth story for commodities remains difficult. Clearly, we've seen that through the first quarter. Going forward, we're still optimistic, and we talked about this last time, and I was more optimistic on China data. I had anticipated that March would be better. It hasn't proved to be that much better than we thought. But I think overall we've had a difficult period in terms of the first quarter. A lot of factors there which can be allocated to reasons why we saw the slowdown there. But I think looking forward, I'm still quite optimistic into the second quarter. I do think we will see a rebound from Chinese activity, so that is going to be good for commodities. In general, the commodity story is still intact. We still very much believe in the commodity bull story. And likewise, when we talk about inflation or on gold, we still believe that there is a good story for gold, but the real issue is inflation at the moment.
Can you explain for us, Jeremy, you know, when we have Chinese data that misses estimates, you know, it's 7.7 rather than 8, or the 0.1s, the 0.2%, what difference does that make to demand for commodities from China? Can you just sort of clarify that for us? Because still the economy is growing at an extremely strong rate, isn't it?
I don't think at the end of the day it makes a huge amount of difference, to be honest with you. I think it's more expectations that we see. And it's clearly we came into the start of this year with a lot of expectations about demand growth out of China and the US. And we started to see those expectations have been tampered down a little bit, okay? But clearly there are some underlying weakness, or there was underlying weakness in the seasonal activity of manufacturing, plus the Lunar New Year and what have you. So there was that weakness there, but I think the market has become far too bearish just on a growth number which has come down from 7.9 to 7.7%. I mean, that for me is exceedingly bearish market pricing in at the moment, and we just don't think that's the case going forward.
As you say, inflation is the key determinant of commodity prices, but you still think inflation is in the pipeline. It's only a matter of time before it feeds through. What opportunities does that create for us right now, Jeremy? Because it's not feeding through yet. What opportunities does that create for us right now when it comes to investing in commodities? I
think it creates a great opportunity because I firmly believe we are in a mid-cycle correction, not only for commodities but also for gold itself.
Is this still a super cycle?
It is still a super cycle, if you want to call it that one. I think we still have a very good opportunity. And you mentioned 8% growth on an economy like China. Even if it goes down to 7%, that's a huge growth number. That's a huge growth number, after all. And so I think it's creating some very good opportunities for those strategic long-term investors that want to take an allocation into
commodities. Such as? Give some examples. What should we be buying within the industrial metal space?
Within the industrial metal space, I think definitely there are some good metals there. If you're looking at long term, I like those metals which are really been hit recently. I think, you know, metals like lead, zinc are looking interesting, but this is a long-term story here. This is not a few month story. Even nickel, I think, is an interesting long-term story. Then within the other areas, grains themselves, it's a very, very volatile market. I understand that one. But I think long term, this is where the issue is going to be. And this is where the interesting story is going to be for commodities. And if we're looking over the next 5 years, I think grains markets, in the next 10 years, the grains markets, the soft commodity markets, these are the markets that are going to start to take over on the commodity sphere itself. And industrial metals will take much more of a back step.